ask everybody is a pretty general one. It kind of gets things going. And it seems like we're in a pretty polarized world these days. And like I say, you've sort of had an experience of two extremes, both ends of the spectrum. How would you describe, in your current state of being, the present state of the world?
Imbalanced.
In what way?
So, my own experience on Wall Street and with the various addictions I struggled with was, putting my belief that money was going to solve problems above anything. And one of the reasons I think that my article resonated with the rest of the world was because it sort of gave a human insight into all the sort of vast problems with inequality that we're all seeing. And so, I think just as one man with one opinion and one voice looking at a world that has 85 billionaires who have more wealth than 3.5 billion people, I saw, and my story kind of suggested exactly how it is that happens, which is, in my mind, a sort of culture of people, and myself included, that didn't have a sort of spiritual connection with the rest of the world, with our sort of purpose for being here. And so when that, without that sort of spiritual connection, then there's no sort of governor on how things end up being.
So that spiritual connection is new for you?
Well, I sort of believe this. I believe that I came into the world with a spiritual connection, and I believe that somewhere along the lines it was severed, either at the hands of my parents, who were not the sort of worst people in the world, but definitely had both, explosive volcanic tempers, and also, they were sort of addicts in their own right, so, to various other substances. And the thing about addiction, I don't know if you have any experience with it, but, people who are addicted to something, it's difficult for them to be present in their relationship with people. So I got the message as a kid a lot of, you're not valuable, you're worthless, something's wrong with you, you're not important. And so somewhere in there, that connection got broken. And it wasn't until I was 22, which was the age that I got sober from drugs and alcohol, but more importantly, that I started working with this counselor who sort of, for lack of a better word, reparented me, started, dealing with me as if my emotions and my experiences were really important. And that was sort of anathema to the way that I had sort of seen the world before. I was just, that's why I believe that I was sort of constantly trying to prove myself or show the world that I was valuable, is because inside I was just desperate to sort of be treated that way. And so over those 8 years of working with that counselor, sort of slowly, week by week by week of like counseling and meditations and, some of the things that I would have thought was so ridiculous when I just started. But those things sort of built up in me. They just started filling up the hole inside until I got to a point where I actually, where I am now, which is that I'm insecure sometimes and I, have a lot of problems and all those things, but I have this sense of sort of who I am and what I'm about that I believe is sort of the essence of a spiritual connection.
Well, you asked me, I have experiences with addiction as well in my family, and one of the great things about being exposed to dramatic contrast is that it's easy to see another side when you've had a dramatic when one side's dramatic. It's kind of it's easier to see the other side. Can you describe perhaps like the person that you were, the person that you needed to be a successful in that world, a world of Wall Street and trading?
Yeah, so the person that I was like, there was a duality to the person that I was. So inside, at my core, I was terrified, self-hating, insecure, and I generally believed that I wasn't enough. And so to sort of compensate for that inner person was this outer facade that I had constructed that was tough. Like I used to get in a lot of fights, did a lot of drugs, was sort of a braggart, and was, very focused on these external markers of success, like, the school that I went to or the, bank that I worked for. So that's who I was.
Is that how you describe most of the people that work on Wall Street that you knew? Or are they various degrees of nihilism or self-absorption? Or is it the full gamut of human nature?
It's sort of a tough sort of position that I've sort of put myself in some sense, which is that, you know, I don't like, as
Yeah,
they would say, taking somebody else's inventory and pointing to a particular
yeah,
person. All I can say is, first of all, this was my experience, but also my own experience gave me a lens through which to see the culture as a whole. And the culture as a whole is one that talks about the amount of money that somebody has as a proxy for the sort of value of that person in the world, and the amount of your percentage return on capital as a signifier of how valuable you are as a human being, and also is a world where you know Wall Street is this funny place because as I said to somebody before, 90% of Wall Street, it's my estimate that 90% of Wall Street believes they are underpaid. And that's sort of mind blowing because even those people, and me included, in some sense knew intellectually that we were overpaid. But at the same time, we'd look at our bosses and the people above us and be like, God, they have so much, and we only get paid $1 million or $2 million. So there was that sort of like duality and sort of lack of perspective in the culture that I believe comes from overcompensating for a place of, brokenness.
well, it seems like in many ways these are the people running the planet today, that's why I don't want to turn this into a gossip thing where you're talking about other people. I agree with you. It's not genuine, not worthwhile. But it's interesting from the fact that the world is definitely being run by people who seem to be quite self-absorbed and have very little interest in the whole picture. So it's kind of interesting to get insight into that world because it's so far from, well, maybe it's not so far because we each feel that to our own extent, I imagine.
Well, that's the thing, and I think honestly, I think that's why my story resonated so much. Is I think we're also used to sort of like pointing at people and saying, Wall Street's bad because they're self-absorbed and they're blah blah
Right.
blah. And there was something about my story, and I think it was just the sort of total honesty that I told it with, that people were like, oh no, I actually identify with this guy. And first of all, that's sort of scary because I've been so used to hating Wall Street people, but now I'm sort of feeling his story and understanding it. And also, even on a bigger level, then I think that sort of scared people because then it sort of explains in a very human way why it is that why we are where we are. Do
Right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, totally. So I don't know. Do you feel compelled to? Obviously, you're self-aware in a different way now than it sounds like you were then. Do you feel some sense of trying to affect change in the world?
It's a funny thing. Like when I first put that article out, and then the first guy came in that said, "Hey, I'll give 25% of my money to charity." And for a brief moment, I was like, "Oh my God, I'm going to make real change here." I started calling my Wall Street friends, and I was like, "If you give 25%, and then I can get this guy, then we can all be blah blah blah." And very quickly, I ran into a brick wall. And I think that my own experience with addiction leads me to believe that you are just not going to be fixed, or you're not going to seek help until you're ready.
Right.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so, like, I do not think that I can change people's belief systems on Wall Street with one little article in any shape or form. All I can do is sort of, I believe, provide an example of a path that the sort of low-hanging fruit might be able to sort of jump onto. So, like, but there are people like, Wall Street's this big spectrum like anything, right? But there are a lot of people there that are trapped and feel empty and trapped in their jobs and sort of want to get out but can't muster the courage. And those people, if they're close to ready, maybe by reading my article, they can be like, oh, this is possible. You know what I mean? But that's, in a sense, I feel like I'm going to have as much impact on Wall Street or on other people instead of Wall Street, because I do think that like 90% of the letters I've gotten have not been from Wall Street people. They've been from your average person saying, you know what, I actually identify with that. That thing that's in you, that's in me too. And just because I'm on sort of the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder,
Right.
that's only because that's not because of what's inside me. That's just because of outside forces.
Right. Right. So I ask everybody this too that I speak with. I speak with spiritual leaders and scientists, quantum physicists, everybody. I agree with you. Everything has to start from within. Obviously, suffering seems to be a part of our human nature to grow, and it seems like we're going to have to take the world with us to a pretty extreme degree of suffering before everybody seems to need to wake up. What do you think it's going to take?
Well, look, I will tell you this. Like Alice Miller, the woman who wrote "Drama of the Gifted Child," among several other things, she talked about this idea of enlightened witnesses, and she said that the one difference between people that have experienced massive abuse as a child and effectively turn into their abusers, or people who've experienced that same trauma and turn into sort of functioning human beings, is a single person. She called him an enlightened witness, but it could be a mentor of any sort that suddenly comes into somebody's life. And that one bit of acknowledgement or reality or valuing of that person can change everything. So in some sense, I feel sort of like totally powerless to impact the rest of the world because I'm just one person, and even with all this media exposure, it's just like a drop in the ocean compared to like all the other images of Wolf of Wall Street and billionaires and red carpets and all these things. But on the other hand, one person and one voice is valuable, and that might change one person, and person might change their kid, and all of a sudden, 10 generations from now, the world looks different.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm doing it too. Even if I just affect one person, it's worthwhile to me because that's all I can do is to add my little bit to the critical mass towards self-consciousness. So what is for you? What was it that you heard? What whisper was it in your ear, or what did you hear that kind of turned the light on for you?
There was just something. I mean, there were so many whispers along the way, but there was something inside me that said there was this deep argument inside me. But there was this voice that was saying, what you're talking about is important. And then there was the countering voice that was like, you idiot, you're just a rich Wall Street guy. Nobody's going to care about Wall Street problems. It's the epitome of high class problems, right? But there was a voice inside me that was saying, like, this thing that I went through, fear that I went through about stepping off this path and about, disappearing into anonymity, even though I wasn't facing homelessness or, lack of water or anything real, it still was real. And I think it was real because of this culture that we were raised in and this sort of lack of spiritual connection. But for whatever reason, I just felt like it was important.
And I guess you had to re-identify yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know 100% sure know what you mean, but I think that you mean like I had to like come out and like fully expose myself in the most honest way that I possibly could.
Well, I guess, and also you identified yourself as a wealthy, on the ball, up and coming, whatever you thought you were. I guess that's how you identified yourself. Now, how do you identify yourself?
Look, I just identify myself as like a single person living this like fantastic life. I mean, one of the things that I was on this show the other day and they accused me of like, sort of manufacturing all this so that I could get publicity for myself. And I was sitting there being like, 3 months ago, I was laying in my bed at night with my pregnant wife, running a nonprofit that nobody sort of cared about, having written a book that nobody wanted to buy, and literally working every day with a lot of success at being really thrilled with the gift of my life. Even though, because there still is that voice, you can even hear it, even though it's not whatever, but it was so great and so much luck and gratitude involved with it. So the idea that like I somehow left Wall Street to write a book that would somehow, allow me to write an essay that would somehow get published in the New York Times is so like preposterous,
Yeah. Was that the Bloomberg interview you're referring to?
It was.
Yeah, I just watched that yesterday just to kind of get an idea about you, and it's funny just how some people just get angry and they're so cynical, and you can't even connect with those. It seems like you can't connect with those people.
No, those interviewers did not hear a word that I was saying. But unfortunately, like I honestly, I'm proud of how I handled that. Only because, my message is, and it's sort of like you asked about how I can sort of impact the world. And literally, being out in the world like I am now in my 15 minutes of fame is like, it's really difficult and it's really vulnerable. Yeah. And all I do is try to like get into my body and feel like my heart and literally speak from this I place that is like, this is what I felt like, this is what I felt like. And I believe somehow that just like speaking my truth is more powerful than almost anything.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is, because that's people recognize conviction. Even if they can't do it themselves, they recognize it. And I thought you came across really well in that interview too. I thought you seemed really humble and really centered, and it really contrasted their hysterical attitude towards the whole thing. Well, particularly the woman, I thought was particularly hysterical. But
I sort of think about those times when I was, drinking and drugging, and people would say, you have a problem. You really need to look at this. And I just go, blah, 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 leave me alone, blah, blah, blah. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what the reaction from Wall Street has been mixed. There's been some people that were really inspired, but there's been a lot of people that have sort of taken it personally. And I just, my sense is like, look, I was speaking from this I place, and so if you're taking it personally, then maybe that says something about where you are.
Yeah, yeah. It's actually funny how really you weren't ever accusatory in your article of really other people. You were just kind of explaining your experiences of things.
My experiences, and then how I saw the culture based on those experiences.
So what is your center nowadays? What is your value? How do you measure your actions in the world?
Well, I guess I'll answer it this way. Like, I feel like the goal that I'm always shooting for is humility, which, as you probably know, is this like ever elusive target. And so what humility means to me is, on a general level, like being aware of how my actions impact other people. And so over the past 10 years, like, I've gotten more and more aware of, how things I say might impact somebody, or being able to put myself in somebody else's shoes and see and whatever. And it's like I keep getting better and better at it, and in doing so, just realize how much farther I have to go because, invariably on a daily basis, I say something that upsets my wife, or I upset my twin brother, or step on somebody else's toes. And so I just feel like my whole life is like, without any sort of recrimination or anything like that, but is this like attempt to get better and better at how I exist in the world and how many people I can touch on a heart level without offending them on like an intellectual level.
Right. I guess it's, in a way, it seems almost for myself. It's like you're catching up to the moment and then making that decision right in the moment before all this crap comes out of you, right?
Oh, yeah.
So what qualities that you had as a trader, as a person in that world, what qualities sort of have remained and are sort of the pillar of your being still?
Well, it's funny. It's like, growing up in a rough household like I did, like you learn a lot of things, right? Like you learn, one of the things I learned is like how to deal with disappointment and to always sort of be able to rely on myself since I can't rely on other people. And those things served me really well in trading. And those skills are still with me, even though I've changed my beliefs around them. So, I'm a very determined guy, and I work at things over and over and over until I get them right, and that helped me in trading, and it also helps me in starting a nonprofit.
Yeah, you don't seem to get too flustered by things, and I imagine it's pretty intimidating to have all this attention on you.
Yeah, it totally is. I literally every time before I talk to somebody, I ask God to give me the words that not only not to make myself look good, but just to help somebody else out there. And that if I can always remember, I'll tell you what, this story about me sort of sending in this New York Times thing, op-ed, to op-ed at New York Times, and then somehow not only them selecting it, but plastering it on the front page of the Sunday Review, that was enough to tell me. I mean, I've been rejected by so many people on a writing level that I know that I'm not the greatest writer ever in the history of the world. So for that sort of to have happened sort of just tells me that I'm some vehicle for something. And I don't mean to get grandiose about it, but I do know that it doesn't have to do with my particular skills, that something about my unique background or whatever has put me in a position to be of service to people. And if I can, it's always this fight with me because I can so easily go into ego and how am I looking? Am I going to make money off this book deal and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And if I can just let it go and trust that there was literally nothing that I could have done in my own power to have got me on that New York Times front page. Yeah. And yet somehow it happened. And frankly, I'm in awe of that.
Yeah. It's funny. It seems almost like fate stepped in and put a spotlight on you for that moment, eh?
They did, totally.
So when you were working on Wall Street and the whole Occupy movement was going on, what were your thoughts at that time about all of that movement?
I was sort of sympathetic to Occupy. Although, do you remember what year that started?
I don't. I don't know.
I'm not sure that I overlapped that much when I was actually on there. But I can speak to sort of the attitude that Wall Street had about Occupy, and it's sort of in a similar vein to the attitude that they've had on my article, which is absolute and total dismissal. I mean, it's funny, it's almost like no matter how much noise you make, to Wall Street, it's this like little muffled thing. And that's sort of the case with, I believe, like all addiction, you know, like you have a husband that's going out and getting wasted every night and drinking away the family's paycheck, and the wife is like, you got to give me the money, you can't keep doing this. And the kids are like, blah, blah, blah. But all you can see is what you need to fill your addiction. And that's that's one of the scary things about the article that I wrote, which was like, you know, first of all, it took me, you know, this fortuitous occurrence of a counselor coming into my life and working with me for so long and me being open to hear what she was saying. And it took me 8 or 9 or 7 or 8 years of work just to be able to take that small step of like stepping into the world with only $1 million or so in my bank account. You know what I mean?
No,
like,
I don't know what you mean, but
I mean, that's the thing is like, for me, it's like, I know that, you know, you can really spin my story in a totally ridiculous way. And in some sense, it really is ridiculous. You know, this guy, I only have $1 million. What am I going to do? Like, blah, blah, blah. And that's the whole thing about it is like, that's the scary thing is that it is true, you know, and there's definitely people in the world with $100 million that feel the same way that I do.
Right.
And, you know, a lot of people ask me, you know, Sam, you know, you said this, what is your policy recommendations for this? And what, blah, blah, blah. And honestly, I don't have one because I don't think it's a policy issue. I think it's like a spiritual issue. Right. And I don't know. I can't magically make people have spiritual epiphanies or journeys. And so right. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah. Well, I ask everybody that too. I ask scientists. I ask, obviously, spiritual people. I ask everybody, where do you think change is really going to come? You know, people like, I talked to Noam Chomsky, and he promotes, I mean, you know what he's about. He's very clear on what's going on, but he's not a spiritual guy at all. For you, do you think there is a supreme being or a universal intelligence? Is it what's your spiritual core?
Yeah, I believe that the universe is powerful and there's some consciousness and understanding that is far and away beyond my understanding, and that's about all I get to. And my sort of faith is both very strong and very shallow in the sense of like, I don't really have any idea. All I do is feel the presence of God through the way that I love people and the way they love me and through this gift of consciousness, and that's about it. And going back to sort of like what you said about Noam Chomsky, which is like, I honestly believe that like, you know, that I can do something to change things, and it's sort of like what I did in that Times column, which is like, just continue to speak this sort of like spiritual truth with unwavering sincerity, and know that, like, you know, there have been times in history where one person with one voice has been able to change things, and I'm not saying that I'm that guy, but I do know that it comes from speaking the truth from your heart without worrying about policy stuff.
And you are one of those guys, and there's lots of guys like that, and they're all important. I don't think that anybody should have to apologize for their conviction, myself. Yeah. But unfortunately, you'll get attacked because people do get attacked for standing up and making a statement, no matter what the statement is. Oh. So, how do you foresee the future of the planet? Do you even look that far ahead, even?
How do I foresee it? I feel like we're in an emerging sort of state of consciousness where it's sort of like two poles are rising up. One, people are becoming more and more conscious at the time that the sort of powers of the world are becoming more entrenched and larger. Right. And so it seems like it's heading on an explosive direction that I don't know what the fallout is going to be. Right.
Well, you know, in a way, it almost seems like we've hinted at it earlier, that it seems that suffering is our way of waking up. Yeah. And it seems like the masses are pretty content to just think that this is the way things are and this is the way things will always be. So maybe it will take something dramatic to kind of shake everybody up. Who knows? So you started the charity Groceryships. What inspired you to do that?
Mostly, I mean, I grew up in a family of obesity. I myself was really heavy. I have a younger brother who was like 450 pounds before he got stomach surgery. So I know, like, I look at things sometimes through this sort of addiction paradigm, but I know that, like, you know, food is not as simple as, like, education or availability. It has a very heavy emotional component and belief systems component to it. And so one of the things I saw in sort of around me in Los Angeles was that, you know, people have it so much harder than I do, right? Because they're way on the lower end of the poverty spectrum. A lot of times they're hungry and can't even get their next meal. And then they're also obese because most of the food in their area is, you know, Jack in the Box and McDonald's. And also because there's this huge correlation between stress and poverty, right? And to live in poverty is to live in, constant stress. And so we started this program that said, hey, look, if there is a hungry family out there that's also struggling with obesity, we want to provide them sort of healthy food for a period of 6 months so that they can eat really well for 6 months. But during that time, also create this kind of comprehensive program around them to address all the various issues or some of the myriad various issues that come with obesity, which are, education is part of it, and skills and cooking skills is part of it. But also one of the most sort of important focal points of our program is this like support group with group emotional support and having a group of people talking about their issues and, effectively facing this same battle together. Because we live in this, crazy world where 70+% of people are overweight or obese, but at the same time, the sort of system that creates that is sort of not changing. So it's almost like we have to adapt individually to a toxic culture. And we can, but it's really hard. And so the Groceryships sort of group and strategy is around sort of creating like a beachhead for people to sort of start addressing their own issues within this toxic food culture.
So it sounds like you have to cover physiological, psychological, and diet, all sorts of aspects, I guess, to that.
It's totally multifaceted, but in the end, like, in my beliefs, like, there's nothing sort of more powerful than a group of people sitting together or sort of supporting each other, and that in and of itself is educational, emotional, and spiritual. And so just even creating that space, a safe space for people to share and open up and face truths in their own way, at their own pace, is incredibly powerful.
Was that also a new experience for you?
Well, I have, my sort of spiritual path has really involved this counselor talking to me, and has also involved support groups. And it's like, when I started going to support groups, it was like this idea of like, just so bizarre to me. It was a bizarre feeling to sit in a group of people who were all sort of like opening up and talking about their inner world in a way that sort of towards the end of like improving themselves and their relationship with the world and their people. And, that stuck with me. And for me, like, it's just so valuable to like take 10 minutes or an hour or 2 hours out of the day and say, okay, let's actually get honest and open and share about our inner experience rather than this sort of rat race focusing on the outside that it seems to be what most of our lives are about.
So when you experience that moment of internal conflict and you sense it, I don't know how quick you are in sensing it, probably quicker now than you might have been in the past. What do you do? How do you shift that moment and decide where you're going to take that moment?
I do two things. I I meditate, I call my counselor, but mostly it's like this, I guess I would just call it like grounding. Like, for me, it's a question of like, who is in charge of me at any time? And so often I'm being led by the rebellious teenager inside of me or the little scared kid who is 5 years old getting pounded, And so all this work I sort of do is like trying to get me as often as I can into this adult part of myself that is like, you know what, I am powerful. I can protect myself. I can protect my wife and protect my family. I just have to be in this space of like faith and trust and confidence, both in myself and also in God and the world around me.
So you can identify now the distinct the distinct polarity of your own self, the duality of your being now?
Let's say I can do that oftentimes. Sometimes I'm in a fight with my wife and I completely lose it, and then the next day I'm like, oh God, what was I doing? So I wish I was better in those moments of being able to be an adult,
I guess this is practice. You just keep catching up to that moment, I guess, eh?
That's the thing. I mean, the one thing that's clear for me as far as both wealth addiction, food addiction, drugs, all these things, is that for me it's just a lifelong thing. Like, there is no destination. It's just constant marginal improvement,
And it seems to me that addictive personalities have an advantage to some degree because they have an intent of focus. They have a pretty intense focus, I should say. And you can turn that focus anywhere you want once you're in command, right, of yourself, I imagine.
Absolutely. So, it helps me with my nonprofit. It helps me write a book. It also helps me make some money.
And deal with all this, I imagine. It's pretty, like I say, it must be pretty intense to have so much attention.
It is crazy. Like, I mean, I know this is like, celebrities deal with this all the time. But at the same token, you know, in the past few days, I've been on the front page of NewYorkTimes.com, Forbes.com, Yahoo.com, the Today Show, I mean CNN, and it's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
this is within 2 weeks. You know, like less than 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know this was going to be printed in the New York Times. You know what I mean?
yeah, 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 yeah. What a whirlwind! And imagine, and also with celebrities, they don't usually talk this openly about themselves.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that is really the thing, which is like, you know, in some sense, I don't have to prepare for interviews because I know what I'm talking about. But on the other hand, it's like I was literally on the phone with a Forbes reporter telling her about how during, you know, three or 4 months ago, when none of this was even percolating, that I would literally like lie in bed at night and just repeat like affirmative mantras of like, I am enough, my life is enough. Because for me, it's always like the thing I struggle with is this need to be big and this need to be important. And so I would like, you know, I would really like battle that and like lie in bed and be like, I am enough, my life is enough. And now all of a sudden I'm telling that to a Forbes reporter who's putting it on the front page of Forbes.com, you know, and I'm like, God, I better be comfortable with being vulnerable because that's what I am, you know?
Well, I think it's awesome, and I find it inspiring. I find everybody's story that becomes more aware of themselves and their place within the whole. I find that always inspiring, and that's what I want to do with this project is help share your stories like yours, and hopefully inspire more people.
Yeah, I mean, I think if this interview is anything like what you're doing across the world, I think it's incredible.
Yeah, these interviews are pretty much the same. I'm trying to talk just like a human being to another human being and seeing what the hell is going on here, and you know, what are we doing? Right?
It's super cool.
Great to talk to you.
You too.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.